Hello everybody, what is up? Welcome back to my channel. It's been a while, I know, but I'm here for you now and kicking off with my very first video series. Yes, I cannot wait for you to hear it and to see your feedback. It's really exciting, so let's get started. In 2010, Alexander Parker got his book 50 People Who Stuffed Up South Africa published with illustrations by the well-known cartoonist Zipiro. The book is an excellent read that nicely brings history and current affairs together in a way that's not too difficult to understand. Some of the people in the book, I feel, are mistakenly labeled as negative influences in the country. Parker actually makes a good argument for why each of them are included, making his book a good primary source for my series. Where it falls short, however, is Zipiro's illustrations themselves, which I can only call unimaginative to be kind. These sketches try to use caricature and satire to tell a quick story, but they're just, maybe Zipiro will make it onto the list too. Keep watching to find out. Before we get started, I'd like to ask you to please leave a like or dislike as well as a comment depending on how you're feeling, and I'd like to know who you'd love to see in the list next time. If you want to see more of my content, please press the subscribe button and let's get me to my first 50 subscribers. Alright, with that, let's kick off this video series. I think it goes without saying that a country usually has a person or two responsible for the founding of the nation. This can be the first monarch to unite many kingdoms into one, a mythical historical family, or the people who produced that nation's founding constitution. As you'll see, the Republic of South Africa is a simultaneously old and new concept, with many figures holding the title of founder. But do any of them deserve that title? This country was once called the Tavern of the Seas, and it even became numerous countries in one. Throughout all those transformations, several figures emerged as symbolic fathers of the nation, but I don't think any of them deserve that title, as none of them lend themselves to any universal concept of what it means to be South African. And we've been called many things as a nation to try and cement this national identity, following our history. South Africa is, however, a melting pot, but this thing is bubbling over with centuries of division, war, and people refusing to get along, so much so that we've actually pretty much rubbished the notion of any rainbow nation. Let's find out how we got there and meet the man who started it all. Born on the 21st of April 1619 in the Dutch Republic of the Holy Roman Empire, Juan Antoiny van Rubio is the man we all have to thank for South Africa, our land. Even though he only pitched it as a pit stop for passing ships to supposedly clean his professional image. I'm just going to hit the ground running here and say Jan ruined South Africa by accepting a post to control what was essentially a new colony, despite already being dismissed from his job for misconduct. But I'm getting ahead of myself. In 1602, the Verenigde Oos-Indische Compagnie, or the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, came into existence, becoming what we now know as the world's first multinational corporation, which was great for capitalists. The Dutch were tired of Portugal dominating trade in spices since the 1500s, so the VOC was legally mandated to conduct commerce on behalf of the state. So this wasn't just any multinational corporation. This was a company that could establish colonies, raise armies, issue money, and even wage wars. Now, Jan was already the head of a VOC trading post in Indochina, but he was dismissed in 1645 due to conducting trade to further his own interests. He'd stopped once at the Cape of Good Hope before, staying there 18 days. Before he advocated for the Cape to be a VOC refreshment station, he suggested selling South African wild animal hides to Japan. The audacity. Nevertheless, the VOC approved his plans for a small permanent refueling station and company hospital. On the 6th of April 1652, the Dromedaris, Reiger and Goede Hoop landed at the future Cape Town. Farming operations by the Dutch expanded rather quickly, driving the Khoi further and further away from their ancestral homelands. In 1659, just 7 years later, the shit had already started. The Khoi rebelled but were suppressed by the Dutch and forced further inland. In 1662, Jan left thinking that he had failed at building a small, contained settlement like the VOC wanted. But at the time, there were 130 officials, a few European women and children, as well as 180 slaves living there. Jan persuaded the VOC to let him release some company employees as Freya burghers to farm commercially along the slopes of Table Mountain. This created a racial hierarchy of VOC servants at the top, then free citizens, then slaves from the east, then finally the natives. This was a structure that would be maintained throughout South Africa's development going forward. While Jan left in 1662, just 10 years later with the idea that he had somehow failed, he'd actually successfully founded the world-renowned mother city, posthumously named the father of the Afrikaner nation, and this was celebrated with the creation of Van Riebeeck's Day, which then became Founders' Day on 6 April. This was abolished by the ANC in 1994. His statues and name are around towns and streets in South Africa, and the Cape Town city coat of arms is based on the Van Riebeeck family crest. So his stay was relatively short and sweet in retrospect, but Jan represents the fickle and reckless way in which European powers approached their colonialism endeavor, as well as the destructive power of privilege. He was a known delinquent at work, and yet he still rose to the position of commander of essentially a brand new country that he quickly tired of and left. Fair enough, but man, the idea that anyone would select an unknown landmass as a petrol station is just wild. If Jan cared little for the Cape, then our next guy probably cared less for the presence of Europeans in South Africa. To the point it seems he missed an opportunity to be Southern Africa's great unifier. Shaka Kasenzangakhona of the Zulu was born sometime around 1787 to the then Zulu chief Senzangakhona and a Zulu maiden, Nandi. Senzangakhona denied his paternity during Nandi's pregnancy as he claimed she couldn't be menstruating due to having ushaga or an intestinal bug. So Nandi and her son went off to live with the nearby Mtetwa clan. The Zulu were one of many clans in the area at the time, including the Mtetwa and the Ndwandwe, so the Zulu kingdom as we know it today was still in its infancy. Shaka grew up under the care and tutelage of Chief Dingiswayo Mtetwa, who developed him into a strong warrior under his age-based Ibuto system. Amabuto, the singular for Ibuto or warriors, were divided into regiments based on their age. In 1816, Shaka returned to the Zulu following his father's death with an eye for the chieftaincy. He won his seat by killing his half-brother and started work on militarizing his people and expanding his kingdom. This is when Shaka began his ruthless campaign to squash his rivals, pay back his enemies, and terrorize the other tribes inhabiting Zululand and the surrounding area. This period was called the Mfecane, or the upheaval. In 1818, Shaka won the Battle of Gqoki Hill in vengeance after his mentor had been murdered by the chief of the Ndwandwe. Shaka's armies were so violent at this time that those in the area who somehow survived the onslaught of his armies or who angered him in any way felt compelled to leave. They, however, used Zulu tactics in clearing the path for their escape from him. The Ndwandwe Zulu War was the epicenter of the Mfecane. His army was said to be schooled in brutality, and Shaka himself was the inspiration for other warlords who conquered tribes in modern-day Mozambique, Zambia, and Zimbabwe with a trail of corpses and destruction. In 1827, when Nandi, his mother, died, He wanted to ensure his people would feel his pain, so Shaka ordered all pregnant women as well as their husbands to be executed. He was scared any child he would have would try to kill him, so any lover or concubine who fell pregnant would be murdered. He was the driving force behind the period of annihilation, which started in the hills of Zululand and spread into modern-day Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Malawi, Botswana, Lesotho, and Swaziland. That's almost the entire area of southern Africa. In his quest to consolidate power over the smaller tribes that he had conquered, Shaka was exceptionally ruthless as well as jovially ignorant of the impact of Europeans in South Africa. He considered their technology, i.e. weapons and ships, inferior to that of Africans. He wasn't serious about brokering any land deals or trade with them. Shaka, to me, was successful in expanding his kingdom, but everyone around him was afraid of him and sought to be as far away from him as possible. Those who admired him only replicated his violence and brutality. Shaka taught those around him to conquer and control their subjects, which greatly influenced the general social outlook of the Zulu and other southern Africans. He also massacred his own people. And for what? He's unashamedly celebrated by the Zulu and South Africans today, and I always feel bittersweet about this man because he was so proud of his beautiful black skin in the face of colonizers, and he laughed off the idea of their racial superiority. And another thing, he actually realized his ambitions of growing his kingdom, but his insatiable appetite for violence gave him a bad reputation amongst his fellow Africans. Something that's still evident in the tribalist tendencies of South Africans today. He died by the hands of his half-brothers, who bludgeoned his head. They threw his lifeless body into an empty grain pit and filled it with rocks and soil. Shaka Zulu was too proud to take the Europeans seriously, but his half-brother went to new lows to show his contempt. Dingani was also a son of Senzangakhona. He was said to have weighed over 150 kilograms, so he was a big guy. He was also described as dangerously inept. In 1837, the trekker Piet Retief entered Dingani's KwaZulu to request a grant of land for some of his Afrikaner or Boer followers who were fleeing the Cape where slavery was illegal. Dingani agreed to grant the land, provided that Retief returned stolen cattle for him from the Tlokwa people. But he had no intention of fulfilling the request. Retief successfully recouped the cattle, so Dingani solved his little dilemma by having Retief, his men, 185 women and children, as well as 250 slaves, murdered. This brutality is said to be the basis for the entrenched racial divisions in South Africa. What Dingani did to Retief was cruel, particularly because it served no greater purpose than to seemingly amuse himself, the way Parker puts it in his book. You'll find deep distrust of black people in general and Zulu people in particular among Afrikaners, and it looks like there's a consensus among historians that Dingani's actions towards these trekkers are responsible. And for those of you who didn't know, South Africa's festering race situation is way older than apartheid. Anyways, Dingani stuffed up by firstly acting in bad faith, not to sympathize with colonizers, but don't retaliate by playing games with people's lives, and secondly, doing it for no gain to his people. They were eventually driven from their lands, and the Afrikaners entered into a new phase of solidifying their foothold on southern Africa in a clash with the mighty British Empire and its army of snooty aristo bureaucrats. In 1897, a diplomatic mission to calm down the Afrikaners saw the introduction of Lord Alfred Milner to southern Africa. The Boers needed some calming down because they didn't like the fact that there were British settlers getting rich from gold mines at the Witwatersrand. Milner's job as High Commissioner was actually to claim the areas known as the Boer Transvaal, the Cape Colony, as well as the rest of southern Africa on behalf of the British Empire. And he was so enthusiastic about the goals of empire, let me tell you. Before we go any further, I just want to explain something. Sometime in the 18th to 19th century, the Freya burghers, or the free citizens, had started to form an identity of their own based on their experience as Dutch settlers. At this time, people such as the Vryburgers were being referred to as Afrikaners by the Dutch, seeing as they were now living in Africa permanently. The language that developed from their interactions with the natives and slaves from the Cape became Afrikaans. The hard-working and determined Cape Dutch gave the word, as well as the identity of the Boer, to their descendants. Early Afrikaners and arguably modern Afrikaners identify closely with Boer culture and history as the cornerstone of their traditions, ideology, and beliefs. Milner was what we call an Anglophile, someone who loves all things English to the point of obsession. He believed the Afrikaners were racially inferior to the British, and he triggered a war by trying to force the Cape and the Transvaal away from them. He was supposed to negotiate the settlement and voting rights of British Uitlanders or settlers living in the Boer republics at the time. The Boer president, Paul Kruger, was reluctant to grant them the vote because they already outnumbered the Boers 2-1. Well, Milner refused to concede to any of Kruger's suggestions. This kicked off the Second Anglo-Boer War. The war resulted in 60,000 Boer deaths and, in my opinion, nobody won. In the post-war negotiations, Milner refused to come to any concessions about voting, jurisdiction, or mining with the Boers. He wanted to subjugate them. His views on empire in relation to Southern Africans, white and black, only served to entrench the social divisions in the colony, but his legacy has been cleaned to reflect him as a respectable English gentleman on a royal mission. He is behind many notable private schools in South Africa, schools that still have a distinctly British character when it comes to traditions and social outlook. Milner prominently campaigned for war with the Boer republics. Hostile views against the Afrikaners, as well as his backhandedness in dealing with them, might be the catalyst for the Afrikaner tendency to be fiercely protective of their nationhood. Kruger's men were so overwhelmingly outnumbered that their army was scattered into guerrilla units, and they still managed to stand up for themselves after the war to negotiate with Britain. Well, this just goes to show the idiocy of colonialism. Another British guy who absolutely hated South Africans made his way over in 1870 when his parents decided the fresh air at Natal would be better for his asthma and weak lungs. Well, it was a good call because by the time he was 35, Cecil John Rhodes was a billionaire by today's calculations. He did this by monopolizing diamond mining in Kimberley with his company De Beers Consolidated Mines. Rhodes believed in the superiority of white English people, as well as in, quote, the rightness and necessity of the British Empire, end quote. He believed Southern Africans were so inferior, in fact, that he wanted the majority of them to spend their lives doing manual labor. He confiscated land from natives at the Cape, and he played a big role in the Natives Land Act of 1913 that relegated just 10% of the land in South Africa for them to settle on. Rhodes had what they call the imperial factor. That's wealth, including strong political instincts. This went hand in hand with what is nicely called suppressio veri, or a suppression of reality. He was actually secretly signing business deals in London that increased his personal wealth as well as his footprint on the continent. He won mining rights in several areas by leaving important clauses out of the contracts that the native chiefs would sign. Being so righteous in his loyalty to the British Empire, Rhodes actually hated to be supervised by imperial officials in London. This puts a fine point on the success of corruption in establishing South Africa. In the early 1890s, Rhodes and some of his associates created the British South Africa Company, another enterprise Rhodes used to buy mining rights and ever-expanding stretches of land in Africa. By 1894, the territories of which his BSA had control comprised a 1,143,000 square kilometer stretch of land between the Limpopo River and Lake Tanganyika, which officially came to be known as Rhodesia. This iconic cartoon shows Rhodes's very visible and tangible impact on Africa, as well as his desire to construct a railway line running from Cape Town to the city of Cairo in Egypt. Was he a ruthless imperialist and white supremacist, or, as they say, a man of his time? Rhodes left a lot of his money to a scholarship awarded for studies at Oxford in the United Kingdom. He made it clear that race should not be considered when selecting candidates. On the other hand, he has recently come under scrutiny in South Africa, as evidenced by the hashtag #RhodesMustFall movement, which highlighted the lack of systemic post-apartheid racial transformation. Rhodes was at the center of the protest because he quite literally stole land from Africans, and this has always been a bit of an afterthought. The conversation about land restitution continues to veer off into nationalism as well as the threat of radical communism. If you can, please look up more on Cecil John Rhodes so you can really see all the details of how he stole so much from Africans by lying and playing with the legal rules of the British Empire and how it operated on its colonies. I personally cannot side with the man of his time arguments because he was so bigoted, he was almost broken, and he used the people of Southern Africa and its resources as his personal property. So, if you've made it all the way to the end of the video, good on you and thank you so much. If you'd press the like and subscribe button, I'd appreciate that even more. We're up to the early 20th century in South Africa, and it's clear that the main issues are the attitude in the area since the Europeans arrived in the 17th century, as well as, you guessed it, with Jan van Riebeeck, Shaka, Milner, and Rhodes, we see an approach that looks a lot like scrambling for authority, power, and resources, and with the exception of Shaka, a concerted effort to secretly disregard higher legal authorities. And it's a catchy book title to say people stuffed up South Africa, but I agree with Parker on these 5 catastrophic founding fathers. And I'll call them that because they all contributed to creating specific cornerstones of the country, like, for example, the Zulu kingdom or the Afrikaner people, and expanding the population, economy, and culture. They are all a few generations apart, so they didn't collaborate in the foundation of the nation like typical founding fathers, but their collective actions over the centuries added up to what became South Africa. Their descendants inherited their ethnic antagonism, egomaniacal leadership style, as well as the tendency to bounce once you've had a taste of everything on offer at the good old Tavern of the Seas. Well, that is all, guys. Let me know what you thought of the video and the people included in it. And also, don't forget to get yourself a copy of any of Parker's books and enjoy that smooth mix of humor and history, as well as Sapiro's contribution summed up here in this cute recreation of the Dutch encountering the Khoi. The punchline is that the neighborhood truly did go up in smoke and the locals lost big time. It's funny because it's true. Anyways, that's all for episode 1 of Who Messed Up South Africa and How. Let me know what other kinds of videos you'd like to see from me. Remember to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.